Most fraud leaves fingerprints, forged signatures, fake documents, numbers that don't match, trails that lawyers can follow. But there is a kind of theft that leaves no fingerprints at all, because the victim signs everything himself, with a clear head and a steady hand, and every document is entirely real. Mortimer Duke spent 38 years as a solicitor in Edinburgh. He knew the law, he knew contracts. He knew exactly what signatures meant and what they cost. And then he met a woman in Manila who understood something he didn't, that a man who knows the law can still be broken by love. This is how she did it. The first time she cried in front of me, I believed every tear. That's where this story really starts. Not in Manila, not at the conference where we met, not in the months of phone calls that came after. It starts with those tears, because that's the mechanism. That's the thing she understood about me that I didn't understand about myself, that I was a man who had spent nearly 4 decades being professionally unmoved, and that somewhere underneath all those years of legal precision and careful detachment, there was a person who desperately wanted to be trusted with someone's pain. She cried and I opened like a door that had been locked for 30 years. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the beginning, because the beginning matters. I retired from practice in 2021, after 38 years as a solicitor, specializing in property and estate law. I had built a modest but solid firm in Edinburgh, 4 partners at its peak, a good reputation, the kind of practice where clients came back generation after generation. I was not a wealthy man in the flashy sense, but I was comfortable. I owned my flat in Morningside outright. I had pension arrangements, investments, a portfolio of rental properties that had appreciated sensibly over the years. By the time I handed over the keys of the firm to my junior partners, my net assets were somewhere just above £900,000. Not a fortune. Enough. My wife Eleanor had died in 2019, 2 years before I retired. Pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless. We had been married for 31 years, and I will not try to describe what her death did to me, because I don't have the right words for it, and the words I do have feel inadequate. What I will say is that I threw myself back into work after she died, harder than I had since my 30s, and it got me through the worst of it. And then when I retired and the work was gone, everything I had been outrunning caught up with me very quickly. I was 70 years old, alone in a Morningside flat full of Eleanor's things that I couldn't bring myself to move, with no one to come home to and no particular reason to be anywhere at any given time. My son Andrew was in London, civil engineering, busy with his own young family. We spoke on Sundays. My sister Margaret lived in Aberdeen, and we had lunch occasionally. I had colleagues who became acquaintances once the firm was no longer a daily shared purpose. I had a cat named Barnaby who was not, I have to say, a tremendous conversationalist, a former client of mine, a man named Charles who had made money in oil and gas and had spent a portion of his retirement traveling Southeast Asia, had told me before I retired that I should consider the Philippines. He said it had changed his perspective, that the people were warm in a way that felt genuine, that there was something about the pace and the light that did good things for a man carrying grief. He was not a fanciful man, Charles. He was practical and unsentimental. So when he said it with that particular quietness, I filed it away. In March of 2023, I went. I told myself it was a holiday, a change of scene, somewhere warm after a Scottish winter that had felt longer and darker than usual. I booked 3 weeks in Manila and Cebu and told Andrew I was traveling, which he thought was a good sign. "Good, Dad," he said. "You need to get out of that flat." He wasn't wrong. I met Imogen at a legal and business networking event in Makati during my first week. It was the kind of event Charles had recommended, a mix of Filipino professionals and expatriates, organized by a British-Philippine Business Association. I went because I thought I might find interesting conversation, and because the hotel had good whiskey. She was introduced to me by the event organizer as a paralegal with experience in cross-border property transactions. That introduction mattered. It placed her immediately in a world I understood. When she shook my hand and said she'd been working on a documentation framework for foreign property acquisition under the Philippine Condominium Act, she was speaking a language I responded to. I asked her a question about the restrictions on foreign land ownership. She answered it precisely, and then asked me a follow-up question that showed she'd actually listened. We talked for 2 hours about property law across 3 jurisdictions. I thought, here is someone with a serious mind. She was in her mid-30s, professionally dressed, composed in the way that people are when they've worked hard to get where they are and they know it. She wasn't performing warmth the way some people do at networking events, the performed interest, the performed enthusiasm. She was simply engaged. Genuinely, it seemed, interested in the conversation. When the event ended, she said, "If you're interested in the property acquisition question from a practical standpoint, I'd be happy to continue the conversation over coffee. I do this for expats sometimes. Informal advisory, no charge. Just good practice for me to understand what foreign buyers actually need to know." I said I'd appreciate that very much. We had coffee the next morning, then lunch 2 days after that. By the end of my first week, I had seen her 4 times and spoken to her on the phone twice, and I was aware that something was happening that I had not prepared for or expected, and did not entirely know how to handle. She was careful with it. She never pushed. She never made anything feel premature or presumptuous. When the conversation moved from professional to personal, it happened gradually, naturally, in the way that conversations do when 2 people are paying real attention to each other. She told me about her father, who had died when she was 20, and whom she had supported her mother through grieving. She asked about Eleanor. I told her more than I expected to tell her. She listened without rushing me or trying to fix anything. She just let it be what it was. When I flew home to Edinburgh at the end of March, I left with her contact details and the particular, slightly uncomfortable feeling of a man who has started something he doesn't know how to categorize. We emailed. Then we called. By May, we were video calling every other evening, and I was aware that Barnaby had begun sitting beside my laptop during calls in a way that suggested even he had noticed the shift in the flat's atmosphere. She talked about her work with intelligence and precision. She talked about her ambitions. She wanted eventually to qualify fully as a lawyer, she said. But the cost of full legal education in the Philippines was significant, and she was working toward it incrementally. She never framed this as a request. She mentioned it the way you mention a fact about your life to someone you're getting to know. I noticed it, though I filed it away, and the noticing felt kind. In June, she mentioned that a property had come available in Cebu, a small condominium unit in a development near the water, that she thought might interest me as an investment. She said the foreign ownership percentage in the building was still under the 40% threshold, meaning I could purchase legally. She had reviewed the documentation. The developer was reputable. The price was reasonable for the location. She said she wasn't pushing it, just flagging it, because it aligned with our earlier conversations about the Philippine property market. I looked at the details she sent. They were thorough, well-organized, exactly what I would have expected from a paralegal who knew what she was doing. The development was real. The price was legitimate. The documentation appeared sound. I flew back to the Philippines in July. This time I stayed 5 weeks. Cebu first, to view the property, then Manila. Imogen had arranged viewings, liaised with the developer's agent, prepared a summary of due diligence points she thought I should raise. She was efficient and precise, and entirely professional about all of it. But we were no longer just professional. That had shifted somewhere in the months between March and July, without either of us formally saying so. We had dinner in Cebu, where the food was excellent, and the evening ran until midnight, and the conversation went places that had nothing to do with property law. We walked along the waterfront. She took my arm at one point in the way people do when they've decided something privately that they haven't said out loud yet. I bought the condominium unit in August, £87,000, which was fair value for what it was. I told myself it was an investment, which it partly was. I told Andrew I had purchased a property in Cebu as a retirement asset. He asked if I was planning to spend time there. I said possibly. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, are you seeing someone?" I told him I had met someone. Yes, that it was early, that I wasn't sure of anything yet. He said, I want you to be careful, all right? Not because of anything specific, just in general. I told him I was a solicitor. I understood contracts, and I understood people. He said, those aren't always the same thing. He was right. Of course, Andrew has always been perceptive in ways that I took too long to properly appreciate. The relationship deepened through the latter half of 2023. I was spending roughly 1 month in 3 in the Philippines, Cebu mostly, sometimes Manila. Imogen had been helping manage the condominium, liaising with the building administration. overseeing some minor fit-out works I'd authorized. She was good at it. She was good at most things she put her attention to, which was one of the things I genuinely admired about her. What I didn't clock quickly enough was the pattern underneath the competence. Every time she managed something for me, every time she liaised, arranged, organized on my behalf, it shifted the center of gravity slightly. She became more embedded in my financial life in the Philippines, not through deceit, but through genuine usefulness. And genuine usefulness, I now understand, can be a very precise tool. In November, she told me she needed to talk to me about something serious. We were in the Cebu flat. I had furnished it by then, made it livable, spent enough time there that it felt like somewhere I belonged. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and her manner was different from usual. Quieter, more careful. "I don't know how to say this," she said. "Just say it," I said. She told me that her mother was ill, seriously ill, that the diagnosis had come 3 weeks earlier, and she hadn't known how to tell me. She said her mother needed surgery and ongoing treatment that would cost approximately 1.2 million pesos, roughly 17,000 pounds at the exchange rate then. She said she had some savings, but nowhere near enough. She said she was not asking me for money. She was just telling me because she had been carrying it alone, and she was exhausted from carrying it alone. I said, "Imogen, of course I'll help." She shook her head. She said, "I'm not telling you so that you'll offer. I'm telling you because you're the person I tell things to now. I'm not asking." I said, "I know you're not asking. I'm offering." She started crying, not dramatically, very quietly. The way someone cries when they've been holding themselves together for weeks, and someone finally says the right thing. I moved to sit beside her, and she put her head against my shoulder, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be needed in the right way. After years of Eleanor's illness, and the helplessness of watching someone you love suffer beyond what you could fix, here was something I could actually fix. I transferred 17,000 pounds the following week. There was no document, no agreement, no legal structure. I am a retired solicitor who spent 38 years insisting on documentation for everything, and I transferred 17,000 with nothing more formal than a wire transfer reference. I noticed that, I noticed it clearly, and I told myself it was a personal matter between people in a relationship, not a legal transaction, and that insisting on documentation would have been cold and legalistic, and would have communicated exactly the wrong thing, which was true, and also not the only truth. Her mother had the surgery in December. It appeared to go well. Imogen sent me updates, photographs of her mother recovering, messages that were warm and grateful. She said, "You gave me back something I thought I was going to lose." I don't know how to tell you what that means. I told her she didn't need to tell me. That was enough. In January of 2024, the emotional register of our relationship changed in a way I registered but didn't examine carefully enough. She became more intense, more demonstrably invested. She talked about our future, about what it would look like long-term, about whether I would consider eventually formalizing things between us. She raised the subject of marriage once, obliquely, and then pulled back from it. She said she knew it was early. She said she didn't want to pressure me. The pulling back, I now understand, was as deliberate as the raising. In February, she raised a property matter. A house in Bulacan, her family home, where her mother was recovering, was, she said, at risk. Her brother had accumulated debts that were secured against the property, and the creditors were pressing. The house had been in the family for 30 years. Her mother was still recuperating. If the house was lost, there would be nowhere for her mother to go. The amount needed to settle the debts and clear the title was approximately 55,000 pounds. She did not cry when she told me this. She was very controlled about it. She said, "I know this is too much to ask. I'm not asking. I just need you to understand what I'm dealing with, because you asked me why I seemed distracted, and this is why." She said it was her problem, and she would find a way to deal with it. I said I wanted to help. She said, "Mortimer, I can't let you keep doing this." I said, "You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing." She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Why are you this good to me?" And the question itself, the genuine bewilderment in it, made me want to prove the answer. I transferred 55,000 pounds in 2 tranches over 3 weeks. This time there was a document, a loan agreement, she said, because she insisted on it. She said she would repay me when she could. She had prepared it herself, she said. using templates from her legal work. I reviewed it. It looked structurally sound. It had the right clauses. I signed it. A solicitor reviewed his own loan document and satisfied himself and signed it. I still find that remarkable, looking back. The document was real. The agreement was real. The problem, as I much later discovered, was that the debt it described had been manufactured or heavily inflated, and the funds that cleared it went somewhere other than entirely to creditors. But at the point of signing, the document was genuine and my signature was free and informed. That is the thing about what she did. Nothing was forged. Nothing was falsified in the way that leaves traces. The manipulation was entirely emotional, and I was entirely complicit in it because she understood exactly how to speak to the parts of me that wanted to be the kind of man who steps up. March brought the first signature that still makes me catch my breath when I think about it. She came to the Cebu flat on a Tuesday evening looking, I thought, as though she'd been crying before she arrived. When I asked her what was wrong, she sat down and was quiet for almost a minute. Then she said, "Mortimer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond." I said, "Go ahead." She said that the property situation with her family had become more complicated, that her brother's creditors had challenged the family's ownership of the house because of a lapsed registration issue that went back decades. She said a lawyer she'd consulted had told her that the most effective way to resolve it cleanly was through a deed of assignment that placed a portion of an established foreign asset, specifically my Cebu condominium, as collateral security on a formal settlement arrangement, which would then allow the family title to be properly reconstituted. She said it was temporary. She said the arrangement would dissolve once the family title was clear, which should take 4 to 6 months. She said she understood if I said no. She said she wouldn't hold it against me. I asked questions, legal questions. She answered them, not perfectly, but competently enough that I found myself moving through the objections rather than stopping at them. She had a document prepared, a deed of collateral assignment on the condominium unit in favor of a settlement trustee, a name I didn't recognize, whom she described as a property lawyer handling the family matter. I read it carefully. I asked about the trustee. She provided a business card, a brief biography, a registration number with the integrated bar of the Philippines, and then she started to cry. Not performed crying. Or if it was performed so well that the distinction became irrelevant. She said, "I know I'm putting you in an impossible position. I know this is too much. If you say no, I understand, and I won't bring it up again. But I need you to know that if you can't trust me on this, I don't think I know what we are. I don't think I know what any of this has been." She said it quietly, not as a threat, as a statement of how she actually felt, or what felt like how she actually felt. That's the sentence I've turned over most in the 18 months since. If you can't trust me on this, I don't think I know what we are. It wasn't an ultimatum in the crude sense. It was something more precise than that. It was an invitation to prove love through action, and the action required was signing a document. And I was a man who knew exactly what signing documents meant, and I signed it anyway. Because the alternative of saying no, of being the man who chose legal caution over trust, who reached for his professional training when someone he loved was in tears in front of him, that felt like a betrayal of everything I had told myself I was becoming. I had spent most of my life being professionally guarded and personally unavailable. Eleanor had loved me despite it. I had promised myself, in the quiet of the flat after she died, that if I was ever given another chance to let someone in completely, I wouldn't waste it on caution. I signed. The collateral arrangement on the Cebu unit covered approximately £87,000 in asset value. Combined with the prior transfers, I was now at £159,000. The second document came in May. By then, things had progressed, or appeared to have progressed, in a direction that felt like life-building. She had spoken with more openness about wanting to get married. I had not said no. She had introduced me to her mother, who was recovering well and who was gracious and warm. I had spoken to Andrew in late April and told him that things were becoming more serious, that I was considering what the next phase might look like. He asked me again to be careful. I told him I was being careful. He said, "Dad, I'd like to meet her. Before anything gets more serious, I'd really like to come out there." I said I would arrange it. I should have arranged it immediately. I let it sit because the timing never felt quite right, and I didn't want to create pressure in the relationship by bringing in a valuation before I felt fully secure in it myself. That delay was one of the most consequential decisions I made. And it felt at the time like sensitivity. The May document was an investment vehicle. She had been approached, she said, by a developer she had a professional relationship with regarding a joint acquisition opportunity on a mixed-use development site in Quezon City. The return projections were conservative by Philippine property standards, she said, around 9 to 11% annually. The minimum participation was £136,000. She was putting in a portion from her own savings, she said, 600,000 pesos, roughly £8,000. She wanted to know if I would consider coming in as the senior participant. I asked if this was the right time. Given everything that had been happening with her family, she said, this is exactly why the timing matters. If this works, and I believe it will, it gives us something of our own, something we built together. It's not just an investment. It's us saying we're going to have a future and we're going to build it ourselves. She said it steadily, without drama, looking at me directly. I asked to see the documentation. She provided it. A prospectus, a developer profile, a land title search, a joint venture agreement. I spent 2 days reviewing it. Some of the documentation had gaps I noted. I raised the gaps with her. She addressed most of them with supplementary materials that arrived within 24 hours. Then she called me on a Thursday evening and I could tell from the first word that she'd been crying. She said the developer had given her a 72-hour window because another investor was waiting for the position. She said she knew that was pressure, and she hated that it was pressure, but it was the reality. She said if I wasn't comfortable, she understood, but she was scared of missing something that could genuinely change the shape of their lives. She said, their lives, she used that specific phrasing. I said, send me the final agreement. She sent it within the hour. I read it, I signed it, I transferred £136,000. That brought the total to $295,000. I want to pause here and be honest about something, because I have spent a great deal of time since then thinking about whether I was deceived or whether I simply chose, repeatedly, not to see. The truth is that it was both, and that the both is the point. She did not give me false documents, mostly. She did not fabricate crises entirely. Her mother was genuinely ill, I believe, and some version of the family property situation was probably real. What she did was shape real circumstances into maximum leverage. She managed my emotional responses the way a skilled advocate manages a courtroom, knowing which arguments to make, when to pause, when to press, when to cry. And I let her, because I wanted to, because being the man who trusted her completely felt like being fully alive after years of being careful and solitary, and professionally untouchable. I had the knowledge to protect myself, and I chose love over knowledge, and that is the most honest way I can say it. The collapse came in late June. I had arranged for Andrew to come to the Philippines in July. I told Imogen. She said she was looking forward to meeting him. The conversation was normal. She called the next evening, briefer than usual, said she had a work matter she was managing. 2 days later, she didn't call at all. I messaged. The response came 4 hours later. Brief, warm enough, but brief. I told myself she was busy. The following week, I called the developer on the Quezon City joint venture. I had a question about the timeline that I realized I hadn't clarified. The number on the developer prospectus rang through to a recorded message. I called back. Same result. I searched the developer's name, the company name on the joint venture agreement, in the Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission online registry. There was no registration matching that name. I searched variations. Nothing. I sat with that for an hour. Then I contacted the Integrated Bar of the Philippines to verify the registration number I'd been given for the settlement trustee on the collateral assignment. The number did not correspond to any registered lawyer in their database. I called Imogen. She answered. I said, I need you to help me with something. The developer registration for the Quezon City venture. I'm having difficulty locating it in the SEC registry. Can you send me the exact registered name? A pause. Very brief. Then she said, of course. I'll dig it out and send it to you tonight. Her voice was completely steady. No hesitation. No strain. She did not send anything that night. The next morning, I hired a legal consultant in Manila. I found him through the British Embassy's consular services list, a man named Addery. Mendez, who handled cases involving foreign nationals in civil and commercial disputes. I gave him everything I had: the collateral assignment deed, the joint venture agreement, the loan documentation for the Bulacan property matter, the settlement trustee details. I told him I needed an independent assessment, urgently, of whether what I was looking at was legitimate. He came back to me in 6 days. The collateral assignment deed was a genuine legal instrument, properly executed, but it had been used to transfer effective control of the Cebu condominium to a trustee who Attorney Mendez established was a nominee connected to an individual with a history of similar arrangements. The deed, once exercised, gave the trustee the right to deal with the property, and it had been drafted, and I had signed it, in terms broad enough that the original protective intent I had understood it to have was not in fact what the document provided. I am a solicitor. I read that deed. I missed it because I reviewed it as a professional would review a legitimate instrument, not as a suspicious one. The joint venture agreement was connected to a company that did not exist in any regulatory registry. The funds transferred under it had gone to an account held by a nominee entity with no verifiable commercial activity. The loan agreement from the Bulacan matter was technically enforceable as I drafted it, which meant I had legal recourse, in theory, against a borrower who had by then effectively disappeared. Total confirmed losses, £295,000. I rang Andrew that evening. I did not prepare a speech. I just told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, I'm coming out there." I told him there was no need, that attorney. Mendez was handling the legal dimensions, and there was nothing Andrew could do on the ground that wasn't already being done. He said, "I'm not coming for the legal dimensions. I'm coming for you." He was on a flight 48 hours later. He stayed 2 weeks. He didn't make me feel foolish, which I had been dreading. He was practical and present in the way that people are when they've set aside whatever they felt in private and decided that what matters now is what they can actually do. He helped me work through the immediate administrative steps. He sat with me in the evenings in the Cebu flat, which was now, in some legal sense, encumbered, and we talked. We talked in ways we hadn't talked since he was a teenager. About Eleanor, about the years when I had been more present to my work than to my family, about what I had been looking for in Imogen, and whether it was possible to want something real and still be catastrophically wrong about where you'd found it. He said, "You weren't stupid, Dad. You were lonely. There's a difference, and it matters." I told him I had been a solicitor for 38 years. I had reviewed the documents. He said, "The documents were real. Most of them. That's the point. She didn't trick your legal brain. She worked around it entirely." That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me about what happened. My colleague from Edinburgh, a man named Hamish, who had been my partner at the firm for 20 years, and who was the person I finally told everything to 3 months later, said something similar but more bluntly. He said, "Mort, we're trained to spot bad documents. Nobody trains us to spot someone who's using our own decency against us." He said it without judgment, which was the kindest thing he could have done. The legal recovery prospects are, as Artie Mendez has been straightforward about, limited. The collateral assignment creates the most immediate structural problem. The condominium unit, which I own, is now encumbered in ways that require litigation to resolve, and that litigation is slow and expensive, and the outcome is not certain. The joint venture funds are effectively unrecoverable. The nominee entity has been dissolved. The loan agreement gives me a theoretical claim that has no practical value because there is no defendant to serve who can be found at a fixed address. I have filed reports with the Philippine National Police Anti-Cybercrime Group, with the British Embassy's Consular Unit, and with Action Fraud in the UK. I have been told, with consistent professional honesty, that international financial fraud recovery of this kind is genuinely difficult and that I should not expect the money back. I have tried to make my peace with that. What has taken longer to make peace with is the nature of what she did, because there was no dramatic revelation, no moment where I discovered a burner phone or a secret family or a signed confession. There was just the slow, methodical process of Attorney Mendez laying out a pattern of calculated emotional management that I, a man professionally trained to understand exactly that kind of pattern in legal contexts, had been entirely subject to for 14 months. She had studied me, I believe, before the networking event. My professional background was publicly available. My firm's history was on the Law Society of Scotland website. She knew she was walking into a room with a retired solicitor who would be more resistant to document fraud than most targets, and so she built a strategy around that resistance rather than against it. She kept the documents as clean as possible. She made the manipulation entirely emotional. She made every signature feel like an act of love rather than a legal decision. And she was, I have to say, with the particular honesty that comes from having had 18 months to think about it, very good at her work. The condominium matter is still being resolved. I am still in Edinburgh, in the Morningside flat, with Barnaby, who has no opinion about any of this. Andrew calls 3 times a week now, which is 3 times more than before, and I have told him to stop treating me like I'm fragile. And he has agreed and then mostly ignored his own agreement, and I find I don't mind as much as I say I do. Margaret came down from Aberdeen last month and we had lunch, and she let me talk for 3 hours straight and didn't offer a single piece of advice, which is exactly what I needed and is not something Margaret has historically found easy to manage. I think she knew that this was a moment that required listening, and she rose to it, and I'm grateful. I've had conversations with a grief counselor, the same woman I saw after Eleanor died, a measured, perceptive person named Dr. Campbell who had helped me through that, and whom I trusted enough to return to for this. She made a point in our second session that I've thought about since. She said, "What you're grieving isn't just the money. You're grieving the version of the future you had started to believe in. That's a real loss. Treat it like one." I had been trying to be brisk about the whole thing. Professional, analytical, forward-looking. I had been treating it like a case to be managed, rather than a loss to be mourned. She was right that those are different things. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 70. After 38 years of legal practice and a lifetime of believing that expertise in one area of human behavior constitutes protection across all areas. It does not. The law teaches you to read documents. It does not teach you to read people who have decided to make their conduct entirely legible and their manipulation entirely invisible. The experience of professional detachment, which made me a good solicitor for 4 decades, made me dangerously susceptible to someone who offered the opposite. I was not tricked by a bad document. I was reached by someone who understood that a man who has spent his life being careful can be overwhelmed precisely by the invitation to stop being careful, and that the invitation only needs to come at the right moment and from the right source. She chose me deliberately. She positioned herself in a professional context I would trust. She built competence before she built connection. She managed every escalation carefully, never pushing too hard too fast, always retreating slightly after each advance to allow me to feel that the pace was mine. And when she needed me to sign something, she didn't argue. She cried. And I am a man whose first instinct, faced with someone he loves in genuine distress, is to make it stop, because I spent 2 years watching Eleanor in pain that I couldn't stop, and the helplessness of that never entirely left me. She used that. She used grief that was real and private, and that she had listened to me describe over dozens of conversations, and she used it precisely, and I am still working on what to do with knowing that. What I'm doing is this. I am being more deliberate about the things that are actually within my control. I'm involved now in an informal advisory group that provides guidance to older British nationals in the Philippines who are navigating property and legal matters. A voluntary arrangement, organized through the consular unit, that Adoni Mendez helped me set up. It's small, occasionally useful. It gives me a reason to apply 38 years of professional knowledge to something that matters, which is better than letting those years sit unused in a Morningside flat. I am not done. I have said that plainly to Andrew and to Margaret and to Dr. Campbell, and now I'm saying it to whoever is listening to this. I am 71 years old and I have lost 295,000 pounds and a version of the future I had allowed myself to want, and I am not done. Eleanor would have had something sharp and clear to say about all of this. She always did. She would have said something that made me laugh and also made me think differently. And I would have told her she was right, and she would have said she knew. I missed that very specifically. Not just her, but the way she always knew the right angle for a hard truth. I don't have that anymore. But I have Andrew, who is learning, and I have Barnaby, who remains professionally non-committal about my emotional state, but does sit on my feet during the cold evenings, which is something. I signed those documents with a clear head and a steady hand. I knew what signatures meant. I knew what they cost. What I didn't know was that the woman sitting across from me had spent months learning exactly which version of me to appeal to. Not the solicitor, but the widower, not the professional, but the man underneath him who had been waiting, quietly and without entirely knowing it, for someone to tell him that being open was worth the risk. She was wrong about everything except that one thing. Being open is worth the risk. I'm just going to be more careful about who I'm open with.